Welcome to session 3. Today we will be talking about the fall, and we're going to talk about it in a larger context than we usually consider it. Part of the story begins this way. When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized that they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. Then the man and the wife heard the sound of the Lord God as he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and they hid from the Lord God among the trees of the garden. But the Lord God called to man, "Where are you?" When we talk about the story of the fall, we're talking about a story that most people are very familiar with. But in our session today, we're going to talk about the story in the larger context, or if I can put it this way, we're going to talk about it as an unfolding fall and the way that the Bible presents that story, not just with Adam and Eve, but in the stories that follow that. So I'm just going to tell you or share with you the storyline itself so that as we talk about it, we'll be able to do so in the context of the larger sense of the fall. Adam and Eve are in a garden that God has created, and God has placed a tree in the garden of which he has commanded or instructed Adam not to eat, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. A serpent comes into the story and approaches Eve, and to Eve casts suspicion about what God has done or the motive that God may have had behind his mandate or his command for them not to eat of that particular fruit. He suggests to Eve that certainly God would not allow death to come upon them if they were to eat of the fruit, and even suggests to her that the reason why God doesn't want them to eat of the fruit is because if they did, they themselves would be like God. As you can imagine, this would be very enticing, and although at this point in the story, we're using words like fall, this was not at all what Adam or Adam and Eve would have thought. If anything, they would have, considered this as an upgrade, as moving beyond who they were and being able to be like God. Eve eats the fruit, she passes it to her husband, he eats the fruit. And when they do so, the eyes of them both are opened. They see that they are naked. They are shameful and guilty and begin to make clothes for themselves or sew leaf figs together for themselves. And they are hiding. There is a sense that something has just gone horribly wrong. God had said that death would enter this story, and although in the storyline itself there is not a physical death in this moment, there's probably something much worse, a death that impacts or severs the relationships that they had had. The beautiful and harmonious relationship that Adam and Eve shared together is severed. The relationship that Adam and Eve had with God is severed. The kind of relationship that they even had with creation is severed. And there is this darkness, this sense of we need to hide, and a clear sense that they had now left the original intent of God. In the story, God then comes down and as he does, is seeking to fellowship with Adam and Eve. And Adam and Eve are hiding among the trees, and God calls out, "Where are you?" And obviously this storyline unfolds. God metes out judgment to each of the parties who are involved. There is judgment on the serpent, and there is judgment on the woman. There is judgment on the man, and there is a sense in which the judgment on the woman and the man are kind of things that are drawn from the original mandates of creation. For example, the woman will have pain in childbirth, and in a sense there's a hearkening back to when God had created male and female, and He had said, be fruitful and multiply. That certainly happens, but now there is a pain that is associated, a labor that is associated with that. God had also said to subdue and have dominion over the earth, and now when man works in the ground or works with the soil, he will do so with great toil, as if creation is pushing back a little bit on him. And so as a result of all of that, of their breach of the mandate of their sin, the death kind of immediately is ushered in with the sin event itself, just in ways that are very destructive, ways in which relationships are darkened, ruined. There's alienation, severance, undoubtedly on the part of Adam and Eve, a sense of desperateness and lostness, shame and guilt. God banishes them from the garden. They have two sons, Cain and Abel. Cain is a worker of the soil, Abel is a keeper of the flock, and in their own expression of bringing a gift to God, Abel brings a gift to God that is accepted by God, and Cain brings a gift or a sacrifice to God that is not acceptable. And in his jealousy or in his rage with how God responded to each of them, Cain directs his anger toward Abel and brings him out into a field and kills him and leaves him for dead in the field. God, just like he did with Adam and Eve, enters into the story, asking Cain for an account of what has happened. And certainly Cain is fearful for his life now because he could be the target of a vengeful act. And God puts a mark on Cain, and this story moves on. In the meantime, Adam and Eve have a third son, Seth. And Seth in the storyline is somewhat or something of a replacement for Abel. So, as the story of Cain and Abel is told, in that same portion of the story, we get several passings of generations, and another individual enters the story. His name is Lamech, and he has two wives. And Lamech, in whatever the nature of his murderous deed or deeds were, escalates the murderous story of Cain himself. So Cain has committed this deed against Abel. Several generations are passing. The story intensifies, and all of a sudden we have Lamech, and Lamech, in a sense, even boasts to his own wives something to this effect: if you thought that the story of Cain or the act of Cain merited the judgment of God, how much more so the deeds that I have committed. And so the story, once the whole thing turns dark and desperate, moves along in that path very, very quickly. And then there is a genealogy that kind of connects the Adam story with what is going to happen next. Throughout the genealogy, we see that people are living hundreds of years, and it is in that genealogy that we encounter just a very brief story of Enoch, who was walking with God, and then God took him or the length of days of somebody like Methuselah, who lives to be 969 years. The genealogy serves as a connection between the Adam and Eve story and the Noah story that is about to unfold. It also serves as a way for us to see that not only is a connection between Adam and Eve, we also see that this whole thing of sin and death progresses along. And at this particular juncture of the storyline, the length of the days, a number of years that people lived after a couple more stories pass by will be markedly shorter than the high number of years that we see them in this opening genealogy. At some point in this storyline, the sons of God see the daughters of men, how beautiful they are, and there is an intermarriage. The product of that intermarriage is that there is something of a unusual group of people who come out of the union of this, and sin and death are continuing through them to spread quickly and rapidly. And it comes to a place where, as God is kind of looking over the spread of sin and death, He has just seen enough. And He looks at the earth, looks over the earth, and He finds one righteous man, Noah, and his family, and it is as if God has now decided that He is just going to send a flood to wash away this whole thing of sin and death, to start the story again, to move back, to reorient. In this sense, Noah kind of becomes a new startup, a new Adam, and so God sends a flood. He has instructed Noah, of course, to build an ark. Once Noah's wife, his 3 sons and their respective wives, and animals by pairs are on the ark, God shuts the door for 40 days. Torrential rains come. God, in a sense, has flooded the earth. And then days after that, once the rains cease and the clouds begin to part and the waters begin to recede, at some point in time, Noah and his family and the animals are able to disembark. Once they do so, there is a moment in Noah's life in which it seems like another kind of entry point where sin and death has an opportunity to just kind of co-opt the entire story. Noah has planted some vineyard. He takes the grapes. At some point he becomes drunk, and one of his sons, Ham, comes and sees the nakedness of his father and exposes him in something of a disrespectful way. The other 2 sons come in. They respect that this is their father, cover him. And there's a sense of judgment that is meted out to Ham and his son, who is Canaan, in that story. So, in this way, even after the flood, there's a sense in which not all sin, not all death was washed away in the flood, and the earth is being repopulated. And Noah has 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And their 3 sons kind of become the 3 individuals through whom nations kind of emerge. So it's not just tribes or clans anymore. The telling of the story is beginning to be cast in terms of nations. Throughout all of this, God has created a covenant with Noah, basically a promise that assures him that never again would God send a massive flood of destruction, and God marked that, or gave a sign of that promise by a rainbow in the sky. At some point in time beyond this, people were sharing still in one language, and there was a desire among a group of people that in order not to be scattered further across the earth, that they would like to build a city, and in that city they would build a great tower that would reach up to heaven. And so with the new technology in that day of using bricks, they began this building program, seeking to build a way for them to be able just to come right into God's presence himself. Although certainly from their standpoint this looks like a huge and massive building project and undertaking, in the story God has to bend down, or in another sense he has to kind of look over the edge to see this tower that they have built. He knows what their intent is, and so God confuses them with various languages so that their building project would come to a halt, and from that point forward there are now even further spread across the face of the earth. So now that we can kind of see that story in its longer scope, there are a couple things that we can see that hold these stories together. And so let's just take a peek at a couple of them. One is this, that although these stories in their various ways sound so dissimilar from one another. I mean, one is in a garden, sons of God, daughters of men, a flood that covers the earth, the tower. All of these kind of very various stories reveal something about the nature of sin and all that get caught up in the sweep of that. In all of these stories, the essence of sin is the same. It is a desire to live autonomously, to live independently from God and from each other. Or to put it in another way, it is a desire to not be human, to not be what God has created us to be, but to be what God is. So all of these stories hang around the same essential sin truth. The desire to not be what we have been created to be, to not be fully human, and to live in such a way. The result of all of these stories is also the same. Because of that deep, innate kind of desire, there is a sweeping in of death, and even in the original story itself of Adam and Eve, although in the way that we typically measure death as a cessation of life or bodily life, death did sweep in immediately in ways that were probably more dark and more deeply troubling than just a physical death. There was a severance in relationships, obviously with Adam and Eve, a severance and an alienation in the relationship with Adam and Eve and God. Even alienation in the relationship with earth, as now Adam is going to have to toil and work at what he does, and the pushback that he'll get from that, and the pushback that woman will get in birth. So we begin to see that the sin story is fully encompassing, is much wider, creates far much more havoc, is far more disastrous, is far more disruptive than anyone could have ever imagined. And no one is able to escape the grip of this sin and death once it finds its way into the story. It is prevalent over the face of the earth. We see it working its way through generations. We even see it after the incredible story of Noah and the flood and their salvation in the ark, and yet we continue to watch this. So let me encourage you, as you consider these various stories as one story unfolding, when you think about the fall, don't think just in terms of Adam and Eve. Think about it in the greater sense that the story of the fall is not just a story that happens in a given setting, in a given chapter in the Bible. It is a story that begins and is initiated there, but it is a story day after day, page after page, generation after generation, just continues to unfold. So much so that the story which originates, the story that happens with Adam and Eve, as you're following along through the generations and you begin to see how these genealogies, overlooked genealogies, connect groups, they connect history. What they are also doing is connecting the sin story. They are connecting the power and the pervasiveness of death that comes right in with sin in such a way that as the stories unfold in Genesis 3 through 11, it becomes evident that it's not just a story. Fall is not just a story that is localized and isolated just within that context. It becomes a much larger story. In fact, it becomes a story in which we find ourselves in. So, as you are considering and just pouring yourself over these various stories, let me encourage you to think about them in their longer view, to think about the things that you see as emerging in the various kinds of stories that happen, and the alienation, the separation that happens in the way that death presents itself, in the way that the stories move through the generations, and the way that the stories escalate. You can almost see that there's something of a virus, or there's a viral type effect about something that happened when Adam and Eve ate the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So as you give yourself to this, keep in mind that this is not just the story of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah and his family, his sons. This is the story of our humanity. This is the story of all of us in the ways that we decry the humans that we are, or that we dehumanize the humans that we were originally intended to be. And we seek to pursue those things which are beyond the limits, the boundaries, the intent of who God has made us to be. So much so that this sin story not only includes us, it also includes the communities in which we live, all the various relationships of which we are a part, the societies and cultures in which we live, the full story of history and its entire scope, and even beyond that, creation itself. May God bless you as you enter in to the story. But may you also be encouraged as you read through these stories to see the signs of God's grace. Whether He's making a covering for Adam and Eve, whether He's making or giving Cain a mark, whether He is putting a rainbow in the sky and making a covenant with Noah, or whether the earth still is being multiplied by people. So in these stories, you will find yourself, the world in which we live, perhaps not so disconnected from the original story of the fall itself.